In the medieval world, disease was not an interruption of life. It was life. Illness walked openly through villages and cities, through castles and monasteries, through markets and homes. It was expected, feared, misunderstood, and rarely escaped. To be alive in the Middle Ages was to live under constant biological threat, with little understanding of why bodies failed or how to stop it. The worst diseases of the Middle Ages were not rare disasters. They were constant companions. The most feared of all was the plague. When it arrived, it did not ask permission. It entered through ports, roads, and caravans, carried by fleas, rats, and human breath. Entire towns collapsed within weeks. People went to sleep healthy and woke covered in swelling, fever, and terror. Blackened lumps appeared under arms and in the groin. Skin darkened. Blood poisoned itself from within. Death followed quickly, sometimes in days, sometimes in hours. The plague did not discriminate. Peasants and nobles died alike. Kings fled, priests prayed, doctors guessed. Nothing worked. Streets filled with bodies. Bells rang constantly. Mass graves replaced funerals. Survivors learned not to touch, not to linger, not to hope. But plague was not the only killer. Leprosy lingered in the background, slow and relentless. It did not arrive suddenly. It took years. Fingers numbed, skin hardened, faces collapsed inward, noses dissolved, limbs weakened. The disease did not always kill quickly, but it erased identity. Leprosy terrified medieval society not because it spread fast, but because it marked people. Those diagnosed were often declared socially dead. They were forced to wear bells to warn others of their presence. They lived on the edge of towns, separated from the healthy. Charity kept them alive. Fear kept them distant. There was no cure. Suffering simply continued. Smallpox scarred entire generations. It struck children especially, leaving survivors blinded, disfigured, or weakened for life. Fevers burned through small bodies. Skin erupted into painful blisters. Many died. Those who lived carried the disease on their faces forever. Scars became normal. A smooth face was rare. Tuberculosis consumed people slowly. It was called consumption because that is exactly what it did. Bodies wasted away over months or years. Coughs deepened. Blood appeared. Breath shortened. Strength vanished. Families watched loved ones disappear piece by piece. It spread quietly in crowded homes, damp cities, and monasteries. There was no isolation, no treatment, only waiting. Dysentery and cholera-like illnesses killed without spectacle. Contaminated water poisoned entire communities. Diarrhea drained the body of fluids. Children died first, then the weak, then the old. Dehydration came fast. There were no IV, no understanding of electrolytes, only prayers and herbs. These diseases surged in summer and during sieges. When water sources failed, death followed. Skin diseases flourished. Scabies, ringworm, lice infestations, infected wounds. Cleanliness was limited. Soap was rare. Baths were infrequent and sometimes feared. Open sores became infected easily. Minor injuries turned lethal. A simple cut could kill. Wounds from work or war festered. Without antibiotics, bacteria ruled. Amputations were brutal and often fatal. Surgeons used knives wiped on cloth. Pain relief was minimal. Survival depended on luck. Childbirth was deadly. Infections, hemorrhage, and complications killed mothers routinely. Midwives relied on experience and prayer. When something went wrong, there was little to do. Women died giving life so often that it was accepted as fate. Infant mortality was staggering. Many children never reached adulthood. Disease claimed them early. Fever, infection, malnutrition. Parents learned not to name children immediately. Attachment was dangerous. Disease shaped belief. Illness was seen as punishment, trial, or divine message. God was blamed. Sin was suspected. Astrology was consulted. Blood was drained. Leeches were applied. Balance of humors was adjusted endlessly. Doctors believed disease came from imbalance. Too much heat, too much cold, too much moisture. Treatments followed theory, not evidence. Patients were bled until they weakened further, purged until dehydration killed them. Medicine often harmed more than helped, yet people sought it desperately. Because doing nothing felt worse. Hospitals existed, but they were places of care, not cure. They offered shelter, prayer, and comfort, not healing. Many entered knowing they would not leave. Quarantine was primitive but effective when enforced. Cities closed gates. Ships were isolated. Travelers were refused entry. These measures sometimes worked, but often came too late. Fear delayed action. Commerce resisted restriction. Disease moved faster than decisions. The worst diseases of the Middle Ages were terrifying not only because they killed, but because they were mysterious. No microscopes, no germ theory, no vaccines, no antibiotics. People lived blind to the cause of their suffering. They saw patterns, but misunderstood them. They blamed air, stars, foreigners, Jews, witches. Violence followed disease. Pogroms erupted during plague outbreaks. Fear demanded targets. Disease did not just kill bodies. It poisoned societies. Entire professions disappeared after epidemics. Labor shortages reshaped economies. Survivors gained power. Wages rose. Social structures cracked. Disease rewrote history silently. The Black Death alone erased a third of Europe. Cities emptied. Fields returned to wilderness. Knowledge vanished with people. Trauma lingered for generations. Art darkened. Religion intensified. Death became omnipresent in imagery and thought. And still, disease remained. Each generation expected it. Life was lived close to death. People planned around illness. Faith absorbed fear. Routine continued under threat. The worst diseases of the Middle Ages were not anomalies. They were the environment. To be medieval was to wake each day not knowing if sickness would arrive by nightfall. To accept pain as normal. To endure loss repeatedly. To survive with limited understanding and minimal control. This was not a world of ignorance. It was a world of endurance. And disease was its most relentless teacher. As terrifying as plague was, it did not stand alone. Medieval life was surrounded by an entire landscape of disease, each one gnawing at the body in its own way, each one accepted as an almost natural force. Skin diseases were among the most visible and humiliating. Scabies, caused by mites burrowing beneath the skin, produced relentless itching, open sores, and infection. Lice infested hair and clothing constantly. Scratching broke the skin, inviting bacteria. In a world without antibiotics, infections spread quickly. What began as irritation could end in fever, delirium, and death. These conditions were not signs of neglect. They were unavoidable. Clothing was rarely washed. Water was cold, scarce, and often contaminated. Soap existed, but was expensive and harsh. Bathing too often was sometimes feared, believed to open the pores and invite illness. Cleanliness, as we define it, was neither achievable nor always trusted. Respiratory diseases thrived in medieval homes. Houses were smoky, damp, and poorly ventilated. Fires burned indoors year-round. Smoke filled lungs slowly, day after day. Chronic coughs were common. Asthma-like conditions, bronchitis, and long-term lung damage weakened entire populations. When infection struck, these weakened bodies collapsed quickly. Tuberculosis found perfect conditions here. Crowded rooms, shared beds, poor nutrition, and constant smoke created ideal breeding grounds. The disease moved silently through families, sometimes killing parents years after children were born. Its slow pace made it familiar. People learned to live alongside it, even as it consumed them. Digestive illnesses were constant killers. Food and water carried invisible threats. Human waste flowed into rivers. Wells were shallow and polluted. Meat spoiled easily. Milk turned dangerous within hours. Dysentery drained bodies of fluids rapidly, especially in children. Fever followed. Death often came quietly, without drama. During sieges, this became catastrophic. When cities were cut off, water sources failed first, latrines overflowed, wells poisoned themselves. Disease spread faster than hunger. Many sieges ended not when walls fell, but when sickness made defense impossible. Wounds were invitations to death. A scratch from a tool, a cut from a knife, a blister from work. Any break in the skin could fester. Without sterilization, bacteria ruled. Surgeons cleaned wounds with wine or vinegar when they could. But knowledge was limited. Pus was sometimes seen as a sign of healing, not infection. Amputation was a last resort. Without anesthesia, without sterile instruments, without pain control, survival rates were low. Shock, blood loss, and infection followed. Those who survived were permanently disabled in a world with no support systems. Dental disease was constant agony. Tooth decay, abscesses, and gum infections caused unbearable pain. Teeth were extracted with crude tools. Infection spread to the jaw, then the bloodstream. Many died from what began as toothache. Mental illness existed, but was poorly understood. Depression, psychosis, epilepsy, and anxiety were often attributed to demonic influence or spiritual failure. Some sufferers were cared for quietly by families. Others were imprisoned, exorcised, or cast out. Compassion existed, but fear dominated. Children faced a brutal lottery. Many did not survive infancy. Fever, diarrhea, infection, and malnutrition claimed them early. Parents learned restraint and love, knowing loss was likely. This did not mean they felt less, it meant they protected themselves emotionally in a world that offered little mercy. Those who survived childhood were not safe. Adolescence brought new dangers: work injuries, disease exposure, early pregnancy. Bodies were pushed hard. Life expectancy was low, not because people died young exclusively, but because so many died early. Religion offered explanation where science could not. Disease was framed as punishment, trial, or mystery of divine will. Prayer was medicine. Pilgrimage was prescription. Relics were cures. These beliefs did not replace care, they filled the void where understanding failed. Doctors existed, but medicine was dangerous. Treatments followed ancient theories of balance. Bloodletting weakened already sick bodies. Purging dehydrated the ill. Mercury was used as medicine, slowly poisoning patients. Yet people sought treatment anyway. Hope outweighed risk. Hospitals were places of shelter. They offered food, warmth, prayer, and companionship. Many were run by religious orders. They did not promise healing. They promised dignity. For many, this mattered more than cure. Quarantine, when enforced, worked. Cities that closed gates early sometimes survived outbreaks better. But fear of economic loss delayed action. Trade mattered. Movement continued. Disease exploited hesitation. The worst part was unpredictability. No one knew who would fall ill next. Disease did not follow logic. The healthy died. The weak survived. This randomness haunted medieval thought. It shaped art, law, religion, and daily behavior. Death was familiar. It was not hidden behind hospital walls. It happened at home, in streets, in fields. Children saw it early. Bodies were prepared by families. Mourning was constant, layered, incomplete. Yet life continued. People married. They worked. They laughed. They prayed. Not because disease was absent, but because it was unavoidable. To live in the Middle Ages was to coexist with illness, not to defeat it. People adapted psychologically. They normalized pain. They lowered expectations. Survival itself became success. The worst diseases of the Middle Ages were terrifying, not because they were exceptional, but because they were ordinary. They shaped every decision, every belief, every life, and still, humanity endured not through knowledge, but through resilience, routine, and faith. This was a world where sickness was not a crisis. It was a condition of existence. By the late Middle Ages, disease had reshaped not only bodies, but minds. People no longer expected health to be permanent. Survival itself felt temporary, conditional, fragile. Life was lived cautiously, with an understanding that sickness could arrive without warning and leave without explanation. This awareness shaped behavior. People avoided strangers during outbreaks. They fled cities when they could. They sealed houses. They marked doors. They whispered prayers instead of questions. Fear became routine, not panic, a background presence woven into daily life. Quarantine, though crude, emerged from this fear. Some cities learned through experience. Ships were held at harbor. Travelers were isolated. Houses were boarded shut. Guards enforced distance with force. These measures were inconsistent and often late, but when applied early, they saved lives. Medieval people did not understand bacteria, but they understood patterns. Where movement stopped, death slowed. Still, these actions carried cost. Trade collapsed. Food shortages followed. Isolation bred desperation. Many preferred the risk of disease to the certainty of hunger. This choice haunted every outbreak. Medicine struggled to keep pace. Doctors relied on ancient texts, Galen, Hippocrates, whose theories no longer matched reality. Bloodletting continued even when patients collapsed from weakness. Purging stripped fluids from already dehydrated bodies. Astrology guided diagnoses. Treatment calendars were aligned with planets rather than symptoms. And yet, doctors were sought. Because helplessness was worse than harm, people needed to believe something could be done. Religion filled the gap medicine could not. Processions marched through cities during plagues, carrying relics, chanting prayers, begging for mercy. Shrines overflowed. Saints were invoked for specific diseases. Faith became public, desperate, urgent. When disease eased, belief deepened. When it worsened, belief intensified. But faith also turned violent. When explanations failed, blame emerged. Jews were accused of poisoning wells. Foreigners were attacked. Beggars were expelled. Fear demanded enemies. Pogroms erupted during outbreaks, killing thousands who were already vulnerable. Disease fractured societies, not just bodies. Survivors carried trauma silently. After epidemics, cities felt hollow. Familiar faces vanished. Entire families disappeared. Crafts were left without masters. Fields lay untended. Churches echoed. Silence became common. But survivors also inherited opportunity. Labor shortages raised wages. Peasants gained leverage. Old hierarchies weakened. Disease destabilized power structures that had seemed eternal. The Black Death altered Europe permanently, not through intention, but through absence. Death reshaped culture. Art darkened. Skeletons danced in murals. Timepieces appeared, measuring life relentlessly. Literature obsessed over mortality. The idea that death was always near became central to medieval identity. This constant exposure hardened people but did not empty them. They still loved. They still celebrated. They still hoped. Not because they denied disease, but because they accepted it. Acceptance was not resignation. It was adaptation. Parents learned to love carefully. Communities learned to mourn repeatedly. Faith learned to absorb loss. Hospitals evolved slowly. Care improved marginally. Cleanliness practices shifted unevenly. Experience accumulated, even without scientific understanding. Humanity learned by suffering. By the end of the Middle Ages, disease had taught a brutal lesson. Control was limited. Nature ruled bodies. Chance ruled outcomes. Certainty was illusion. Modern medicine would eventually transform this reality, but for medieval people, endurance was the only defense. Knowledge was fragmentary. Power was weak. Survival depended on resilience more than cures. To ask how people lived surrounded by disease is to misunderstand their reality. They did not live despite disease. They lived with it. It shaped childhood. It shaped faith. It shaped death. And still, generation after generation rose each morning, worked, prayed, and hoped not for long life, but for another day without pain. The worst diseases of the Middle Ages were not merely biological disasters. They were teachers. They taught humility. They taught fear. They taught endurance. And through them, medieval humanity persisted scarred, weakened, and resilient long enough to pass the world forward.